Welcome to today's webinar, Defining Metrics That Matter, brought to you by the WCG Avoca Quality Consortium. And now our moderator, Michelle Webb.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening and good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome you to Avoca's fourth webinar in the John Lee series. I'm Michelle Webb, Vice President of the WCG Avoca Quality Consortium, and today's presentation is on defining metrics that matter, and during which we'll hear from experts Linda Sullivan and Keith Doricott, who I will introduce shortly. WCG Avoca is a life science consulting firm founded over 20 years ago and is dedicated to improving quality and compliance in the clinical trial execution process. We integrate deep subject matter expertise with leading industry approaches and technologies to tailor solutions that help companies build quality management, inspection readiness, and effective oversight systems in existing processes. In 2011, Avoca launched the Avoca Quality Consortium, which is a collaborative of over 175 sponsors, clinical service providers, sites, and CRO organizations who all share the objectives of elevating quality and driving innovation across the entire clinical trial ecosystem. Recently, we were super excited to share the news that WCG announced the expansion of the WCG Avoca Quality Consortium, which brings together the WCG Metrics Champion Consortium and the AQC to create an industry-leading organization uniquely positioned to deliver leading practices across the industry. The late John Lee was an early supporter and one of the first members of the Avoca Quality Consortium, as well as the MCC. John was a senior leader in clinical development for over 20 years, and he was a believer in closing the learning gaps at all levels and often participated in Avoca's summits as part of the executive panels, sharing his experience and thought leadership. In 2021, quarterly webinars established in his honor have been focused on sharing knowledge and keeping the clinical trial community connected and informed. Avoca has been pleased to present a series of compelling webinars that focus on expanding the state of understanding the key industry challenges, exactly as John would have been doing if he was here with us today. And now, without further ado, I'm pleased to welcome our presenters, Linda Sullivan and Keith Doricott, who are excited to join forces through the MCC-QC partnership. Linda Sullivan, Executive Director and co-founder of the WCG Metrics Champion Consortium, has more than 30 years of experience working in healthcare and clinical research industries, helping organizations improve processes to improve financial and quality outcomes. She's been a featured speaker at performance metrics, risk-based quality monitoring, quality management, and clinical trial oversight industry meetings. She's published articles in leading journals, as well as served on industry advisory boards such as NIH and CATS Methods, Process Domain Task Force, and the ACRP CRA Competency Steering Committee, as well as the DIA Annual Meeting Program Committee. Keith Doricott is a senior consultant for Avoca. He's developed his process thinking while at Kodak Limited. He's also a Lean Sigma Master Black Belt. He's worked in large CROs leading corporate process improvement. Keith leads metric development and best practice sharing on risk-based quality management, centralized monitoring, vendor and CRO oversight, TMF, site startup, as well as ECOA. Keith regularly presents at conferences such as Scope and Clinical Trials Europe, and his passion is for improving processes, in particular skills for root cause analysis and use of metrics. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to share your thoughts, comments, and questions via the Q&A function, and we'll try to address as many as we can. And if we are unable to get through all of them, we'll follow up with you after the webinar. And so now I'll turn it over to Linda and Keith.
Well, thank you so much. We're so pleased to be here today, and we share your excitement in bringing our consortia together. I'm so pleased to be joined today by my colleague, Keith Doricott, and I've had the privilege of working with him in some of these metric development work groups and community of practice groups over the last 5 years. And we're really here today to share what we've learned over time about how to define metrics that matter, And specifically, we're going to be walking through how to adopt a metric development framework that we use in our groups and you can use in your own organizations. Using this framework can impact what you decide to define, how you select metrics, and also how you use metric results. And we're going to show you how we do it through examples of what we've done at MCC. So before we get into the details, I just want to go over, kind of step back and reflect on a famous quote from Michael Hammer, who's the founder of some business process reengineering concepts. Among the hundreds of managers with whom I've discussed this matter, there's a widespread consensus that we measure too much or too little or the wrong things, and that in any event, they don't use their metrics effectively. Many operational metrics that companies commonly use make little or no sense. And I want to start off with this because if this description kind of hits it for you, like this describes your organization, just know that you're not alone. And this is a common problem faced by companies across many industries. It's not unique to our industry. And in fact, this was the driving force behind starting the Metrics Champion Consortium in 2006. And over the last 15 years, our members have worked collaboratively to develop standardized performance metrics that they use to oversee and manage clinical research. The original approach was to poll companies about what they were measuring and then publish the commonly used metric definitions. And this approach worked well when the industry was focused on using time and cost metrics. But in 2012 to 2015 timeframe, the industry started to focus on quality. And you may recall, this is where the concept of quality that matters began to be explored and was introduced in a variety of regulatory guidance documents. So our approach of standardizing current measurement practices became problematic because many organizations had limited experience measuring metrics. So we were faced with a dilemma. How do you standardize metrics that organizations have no experience using? Well, in 2016, MCC began using this new development framework that we're going to be walking through today. This is a methodology that we call the metric development framework, and it helped us solve some of those problems with how do we get to a point where we're measuring the right metrics. So this is the diagram that illustrates the metric development framework. And we're going to walk through these steps in detail. So I'm going to hand it over. Next slide, please. The first step is to develop a high-level process map. And I'm going to hand this over to Keith so he can show you some examples of how we've walked through this process with some of our work groups and why this is such an important step. So Keith?
Yes, thanks very much, Linda. Yes, so we start with this, with the process map. And in fact, I think it might be best to show you an example of one, which you can see here. So this is an example of a central lab process. And some of you may, if you know the central lab process well, you may be looking at it and thinking, oh, there's much more to it than that. And those that perhaps don't know the central lab process that well might be thinking, oh, I didn't realize it was that complicated. Well, within our work groups, we have people of all different areas of expertise and levels of knowledge, and we work through the process to help define the process, and we try and get it on one page. We don't always manage. We try and get it at a high enough level so that everyone, even though there are differences within their own individual processes, we can get to a common understanding of what the typical high-level process actually is. So we build a process map like this, and it actually takes a lot of time. We start off with a draft, and we iterate. So it takes time as we go through the the process to get to this. I mean, this just looks like one page and you think, oh, well, that can't be that difficult, but it really is. So it helps us in a number of ways. It helps us define as a group what's the start and what's the end of the process. What are the key terms that will be used in metric formula in our discussions that need a definition in a glossary? So for instance, on this one, we've got the lab manual. Well, what is the lab manual? What's the technical specification document, and so on? It helps to align the whole group with what the inputs and the outputs are, because that's what the process map tells you, and the dependencies of any subtasks. And it helps with the discussion of what are the areas that are perhaps problematic, where there might be issues, there might be a block that hinders downstream tasks. So we actually use a brainstorming function. We put the map up on the screen and we get people to sort of scribble on the map and say, oh yes, well, we have problems here, we have problems here, and we can see a picture build up of whereabouts in the process there are problems. And it gives us a reference. So as we develop metrics, and you'll see in the further steps as we go through it, it gives us a reference to look, have we got metrics in the critical parts of the process? Are we always focusing back on the process and what really matters about the process? And in the end, it actually provides context for those that are going to use the metrics. So beyond the definition of metrics, as people look at the metrics, they've got a chance to go and look at the process map and see how do the metrics relate to the process map.
So that process map is really a foundational component of the framework. And you'll see as we go through the next steps, how, where, and when we keep referring back to it. The next step in the process is to define what we call critical success factors. And these really help you define, what are those outcomes that you're desiring from the process? How would you describe whether that process was successful or not? Next slide. So I'm going to let Keith kind of walk through, continuing in this central lab example, kind of, how we move forward with defining these critical success factors.
Yeah, so as Linda's described, we've got our process map, and we look at the process map and we're asking the questions. Well, what does success look like? So now we've got some idea what the process is that we're focusing on. What is it important for the process to actually achieve? And you can see examples here from, again, that central lab process. These are ones that we agree. And again, it takes some wordsmithing on these to get to them. So the first one you can see is really about setup. We want the whole process to be set up so that lab samples can be taken at the first patient first visit. So it's sort of on time and ready. So we don't want anything to be delayed for the study based on the central lab process. And then the second one's much longer. There's actually lots of aspects to it. So quality lab samples, so not just lab samples, they need to be quality ones, obtained. An accurate result, so again, not just any results, but accurate ones. Who should they be provided to? Site, sponsor, CRO, in the shortest time, so as quickly as possible, and with minimal non-value added effort. So there's actually a lot in that one sentence for this. So critical success factors can pull a lot into them, and you can see there's different aspects in both of these. We've got quality, we've got, is it on time? Is it, how much effort does it take? Let's try and do it with a minimal amount of effort. And we want accuracy as well. So there's a number of different aspects.
So as you can imagine, trying to get a full list of critical success factors aligned with that process can take a while. We've only given you 2 examples, and obviously there are more examples that you might work through. But again, taking the time to really define critical success factors is an important step, because it creates that foundation as we're moving towards developing metrics that really matter. The next step is to take each one of those critical success factors and really define those key performance questions that, when answered, are going to help you determine whether each of the critical success factors is being achieved. So we're going to take one of those critical success factors, the one that, as Keith said, is really packed with a lot of detail. And we're going to follow through this example of how we get to those key performance questions. I love this particular critical success factor because it's really incorporating not just time. So often we focus on getting something done on time. And as anyone that works with metrics knows, what gets measured gets people's attention. And you don't want to have critical success factors that simply focus on completing a task quickly or on time, and without considering the quality component to it. We're kind of notorious for doing that in our industry. So we're always looking for opportunities to incorporate that. And in this particular critical success factor, I love the fact that there is a statement with minimal non-value added effort, because that's an area where we could really improve our processes in clinical research right now. So Keith, why don't you move forward and show us, how do you take a critical success factor and start to build some of those key performance questions?
Yes, thanks, Linda. And I just wanted to add to what you were saying about the quality aspect and the non-value added effort aspect before I show that, because this generates a lot of discussion in the work groups. You know, the time ones tend to be fairly easy to work through, but this quality comes up as a question, but what do you really mean? And minimal non-value added effort. And not always, but often the way that works best with groups is to say, well, is it right the first time? How often is it right the first time? Because every time something has to go back and get repeated, then there's non-value added effort in there. And there's the potential that even if it wasn't right the first time, somebody doesn't notice and it goes through onto the next stage. So thinking of it that way, quality and non-value added effort, they sort of come together when you think of right the first time. So we then take the critical success factor, and we've got the questions, and you can see examples of questions here. So these are key performance questions. So these are the questions which, if we can answer them with metrics, will help us to determine whether the critical success factor is being met. So are lab sample queries addressed by sites in a timely manner? That's clearly to do with the quality of lab samples, but also can be accurate results. Are sites being notified of potential safety concerns in a timely manner to manage participant safety? So this is when we say getting accurate results to sites in the shortest time. What is it about the accurate results to the sites in the shortest time? Well, actually, as we thought about it more, we said, well, it's potential safety concerns is one of the most important things that we need to get back to sites. And do samples received from sites meet quality requirements? I think we're going to take that one on a little bit further, but that's obviously the quality, very much the quality piece. There are a set of quality requirements. There's requirements for how the sample should be taken and packaged. And it's a really important thing to understand is when they arrive, are they at the right level of quality? Because if they're not, of course, you may end up not having accurate results. You may not even be able to test those samples at all. So those are questions then that we want we want metrics to help answer. And in the end, the idea is those metrics help us to answer the question as to whether that critical success factor is being met. Now, just as we were looking at with the critical success factors, there's more there. These are examples. So there are more of them. And of course, you can come up with many other key performance questions as well. And in the end, you've got to make a decision about, well, which of these are the ones that we are actually going to take forward and develop metrics for.
So before we move on to developing the metrics themselves, I do want to just touch on an important aspect, which is the questions that you have are often dependent on your roles and responsibilities. So if you're and this diagram tries to illustrate that. So if you're at an executive level where you're really responsible for overseeing across all of a series of studies, your question may be thinking about how do you kind of look across studies, and they're often very sort of high level measurements. So your questions will reflect that. If you are sort of a mid-level, so you might be a process owner, you might be in charge of a therapeutic area, you're going to be looking at and have questions about performance as it goes across a series of studies in your area. And then if you're down at the bottom level here, which is where you're overseeing studies themselves, you're likely to be thinking about those questions from a perspective of, within a certain study. And the beauty of using the metric development framework and going through this key performance question exercise is that you can and should be very specific about what level each performance question aligns with. And you may often have a question that is actually aligning with very different, rolling up and rolling down essentially. And you just need to be sure you include that when you define the question. So it's clear when you get to defining metrics, what level of a metric you're going to be trying to define.
I see there's some questions, Linda, that have come in. Maybe worth just covering those now, perhaps. So how do critical success factors differ from key performance indicators, and how are they similar? So critical success factors are not, so a key performance indicator is a measurement or a metric. A critical success factor is not a measurement or a metric. A critical success factor is something, as we saw a moment ago, it's a statement about what's important for the process to achieve. So they are very different things, and you might be thinking, well, then what's the difference between a key performance indicator and a metric? Because we're really talking about metrics in this webinar, but metrics can be themselves key performance indicators. So key performance indicators, KPIs, are a subset of metrics. Those are metrics that in particular circumstances you might think are the most important ones for us to monitor in a relationship or for a process or whatever it might be.
Great, thank you. Well, let's move to the next slide. Yep. So as you can imagine, you can come up with a whole variety of key performance questions. And so one of the things that you have to include in this process is trying to figure out which are the most important ones that you want to continue to explore and ultimately develop metrics for. So Keith, why don't you walk through, this next piece, which I think is so important and really the power, if you're doing it within a consortium environment like ours, this is really where you gather some really great intel.
Yes, and these discussions are fascinating because, again, in the consortium, we have lots of different people with different backgrounds involved, and you're really asking the question, okay, so that you want an answer to that key performance question with a metric, but why? Why is it that key performance question is important? What is it about that key performance question that you think makes it worthy of spending time to develop a metric? And of course, people say, well, it's focused on a part of the critical success factor. In this case, the key performance question, so do samples received from sites meet the quality requirements? So we're focused very much then on a process step related to the intake of samples at the lab. And because when you look back at that process and you think of how the process works, of course, the next step is going to be onto analysis and potentially passing on to a specialty lab for further processing. But there's a QC check that happens when the samples come in. And of course, that QC check is taking place because they want to make sure that the samples are ready and appropriate for the assessment. So when we then look at this, this key performance question. Why is this key performance question important? Well, we're trying to get an early signal, potentially, by asking this question of whether we might in the end have some missing data. So if we can early on establish there's a problem with samples coming in perhaps from a particular site or maybe from a number of sites, there may be some systemic issue, then what can we do early on to try and get ahead as best we can of that and try and fix that problem? We may, of course, not have data for the particular ones that come in where there's a problem, but if we can get ahead of it, then we'll hopefully reduce the number of the problems we have later, whether it's with accurate data or with completeness of data. So that's really then the rationale for why this key performance question is important. It might be, for example, we might unearth that maybe some of the lab kits that have been sent to sites have been incorrect in some way, or there's some shipping issue, labeling issue, and so on. And it may be something, as I say, due to a specific site, or it may be something more systemic that actually is happening at multiple sites, and we want to try and get ahead of. And so we take this information, we take the discussion that happens in MCC meetings, and we include that, as we'll see in a little while, as part of the definition of the metric to help people understand, well, why did you even pick this? Why did you think this was important? And so as we look at the key performance questions, we go through this process, we discuss each of them and say, well, what's the reason for that being important? And as we do that, some of those key performance questions are the ones that we say, yes, we definitely need this, and we need one or more metrics for this. And others we decide, well, actually, maybe that's not so important after all. And having a number of people with different perspectives is so valuable in those discussions. So we talk about what factors in the process help us achieve success, what needs to be managed in the process, where does the process typically go wrong, and what decisions need to be made. I know there's another question in there, which is it's an interesting one about the critical success factors in this example, or the critical success factor we've got here. Should we try and minimize the use of subjective terms, so accurate, minimal, non-value added, timely, and so on? We don't, not at this stage, we're not doing that. So it's fine within these statements, because remember, these aren't metrics here. These are statements, first a statement of critical success factor, then the key performance question. You'll see when we get into metrics definition, that's where we start asking the question, okay, so you're saying in this example, do samples received from sites meet the quality requirements? What does that mean? What are the quality requirements? And what do we mean? What does it mean when we say meet the quality requirements? And so that's where that part comes in.
So we've gotten finally to the part where we're going to define what to measure. So hopefully so far you can recognize that this framework really, although it takes some time to get through these first few steps, once you've gone through that, I think you have pretty good confidence that what you're going to define now has a purpose, that you've gone through that decision making around what's important and why and how you're going to use this information. So I'm going to have Keith walk through how you go and define metrics, but I just want you, while you have this framework here, to notice that it's not uncommon to have several measurements get defined to help you answer key performance questions. In part because if you've included sort of time and quality components within that question, it's often difficult to measure both of those in a single metric. And we often end up combining metrics together to really help you get that complete picture of that, how to answer that key performance question. So we've walked through all of these aspects earlier in this example. We've come up with a metric definition, in this case, which says the percentage of samples from sites that meet quality requirements. Well, that's just the beginning of a definition. And I want to sort of go to the next slide so we can show you, because we've had these really in-depth conversations about how, where, why, and when you might use a measurement before we ever get to the point where you're going to define it. We include all of those components in a metric definition. And you might notice that there's a lot more things that spaces for data elements here as well. And rather than walking through each of these components, I'm going to have Keith take us through kind of grouping them into categories so that you can sort of see that the method to the madness here. So Keith.
Yes, thanks, Linda. So when you look at a metric that's been defined in the MCC, we can sort of group, as Linda said, we can group those elements of a metric definition, as you see here. So you can start off by saying, well, what's the purpose of the metric? And we've just been talking about, the process, the critical success factor, the key performance questions. So you can look at those and is it something that you might even be interested in to start off with? And second, well, what's the value of this metric? So that piece we were just talking about, why is it important to answer the key performance question? At that stage, we're actually also asking for possible action. So we discuss why is it important to answer the key performance question, but also what would you do with the data if you got the data? How might you handle it? So if it wasn't where you wanted to be, what sorts of things might it lead you to? Because we're doing that because we want people to be thinking of actionable metrics. We also include what the metric doesn't tell you. Now, it's not everything, of course, the metric doesn't tell you, but just some examples, because we've had situations in the past where people think the metric's measuring one thing and actually it's measuring something else. So we give some examples of what it doesn't tell you. Then the detail of the metric definition won't be a surprise. What's the formula, of course? We also give an example of use of the formula. What are the data elements that are required in order to make that calculation, and that glossary of terms. So you're using terms in a particular way. What exactly do those terms mean? And then the other piece which comes out of those discussions again is that use piece. Well, now we've defined that metric. What's a typical sort of performance target that people have? If it's a metric that's currently in use, sometimes we have metrics that are just completely new and novel, and we can't have a performance target for those, at least initially. But others are perhaps more common and people use them commonly, and so maybe there is a performance target. So there's some discussion around that, and we put a suggested performance target in based on the consensus of the group. What additional analysis? So perhaps there's other metrics you might want to consider. And those are detailed in what we call the companion metrics. So those companion metrics, they might be metrics that are looking at other dimensions. So if this metric is focused on time, there might be another metric focused on quality listed in the companion metrics, but also at different levels. And Linda was talking about the different levels of metrics. We might have, this might be at the study level, for instance. We've got one which is looking at the site level, and perhaps one looking across studies at the portfolio level. So lots of information that gets pulled together from those discussions within within our meetings and using this overall framework. There is a question I can see in the Q&A. Are critical success factors generally related to critical data and processes? So of course, critical data and processes, that's a reference to ICH E6R2 section 5.0. They not necessarily, I would say, because you can go through this for any process. Now, whether that particular process you would define it as a critical one is going to depend on all sorts of things to do with the processes you've got in particular studies or within a program. So they might be, but they might not be. I don't think the two are necessarily related. Linda, does that make sense to you, or any other thoughts?
Well, what I think people probably are observing, which sort of makes me smile, is, we have purposefully picked the central lab process.
Right.
Because it is an essential process.
Yep.
You don't use a central lab unless you are using that output, as it's critical data that's coming out of the process itself. And so, interestingly, this is another use of the process map, and the measurements here because often when you're doing the risk assessments in the, with a multi, dimensional team, if you may not even have somebody that even knows, well, what the heck is the central lab process? How we only know that what doesn't come out the end, is there a risk indicator we could be using that could help us understand if we're at risk for not having that data? So they definitely can go hand in hand. And we've actually identified within our groups, where are some of these input tasks, et cetera, that really should be considered key risk indicators. And within the metrics, some of them are identified as KRIs. So there definitely is an association in that way.
Yeah, yeah.
So the final step in the framework, I just want to touch upon briefly. It's not something that we're going to talk about in any more detail today, but it's really important. And that is, when you've gone through the whole energy and effort of defining metrics that matter, you go through and you measure them, you need to really think about the person who's viewing some dashboard or a visualization report. They're trying to answer a question, and presumably it's a key performance question that got defined, right? And so you need to make sure that the results are displayed in a way that you can actually answer that question. And this is where we've often seen the implementation of metric programs kind of not be successful. Either you're implementing metrics, but if you don't give the users the information they need, or if you don't give them the skills they need to understand the context and be able to answer that question, then really the whole purpose of using these metrics, you don't get those insights that you really need. So we just like to remind people about that, but we're going to kind of move on to the next problem, which is, if you are looking at a toolkit, this is, we've talked about all the things that we put into a toolkit. You really need a lot of support in terms of how do you implement the metrics, select the right ones for your program, et cetera. So if you're lucky enough to have access to MCC metric toolkits, you'll recognize that we have some of the implementation support tools in there. If you're doing this on your own within your own organization, just bear in mind that you can walk through the framework, you can get the process maps, those metric definitions, how they align with key questions. But there really are some additional things around which of the metrics you're going to implement, how, where, and when that are important. So we want to move on to the next section, which is how do you select the right metrics for your program or study? So you may have gone through this approach. You've got now a core set of metrics that you track within your organization or you're going to ask your vendors for. But you still need to be thoughtful about how, where, and when you use them in different situations. And this is where you've got to make sure that the metrics align with your program and study goals and objectives. And more importantly, something we haven't really mentioned here, but might not surprise you, is they really should align with your process. For example, if you have a process that's working well, you don't have to track a lot of metrics that are going to support root cause analysis and process improvement. You can sort of rely more on some of the basic metrics that might be more outcome-based measures. And this is really where all of that effort of establishing key performance questions really pays off, because they provide the context needed to help you select meaningful metrics for your situation. And so Keith is going to walk through our recommended 4-step process that our members have the access to the tools to help them do to really select the right metrics for their programs.
Thanks, Linda. Yeah, so we recommend you start with determining the purpose of metrics. So why are you even trying to measure anything at all? What's the purpose of doing it? And then we'll talk about that. I'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. What's the toolkit? So if it's central lab that you're looking at, there's a central lab, a set of central lab metrics at the MCC, but you may have your own set of metrics that you're choosing from. Well, what are they? What do they include? We have these tools to help select metrics, and I'm going to demonstrate one of these in a moment, as well as a tool here, which is to help with your planning the reporting of metrics. So it's not a tool to actually report the metrics, but more to help you plan the reporting. And all the way through, we've got these reference documents. So we've got the overviews of the metric toolkit, includes process maps, the overview documents and webinar and so on. And then we have what we call the metric workbook file. This metric workbook file contains all the details that we were just talking about a moment ago that we put together as we define metrics. So the key performance question, or the critical success factor, key performance questions, why is that key performance question important, so on and so on, all of those aspects, and that's all in the metric workbook file. So that first step, determine the purpose of the metrics. You can see here really the sorts of questions you should be asking yourselves as you're thinking about, well, why are we even trying to do this? Because of course there's effort to measure things, so there should be a reason for doing it, the reason for taking that time and resource. So you can think in terms of the level perhaps you're interested in, whether it's at a study level or country or site and so on. Perhaps there's particular questions you want metrics to answer, or risks or issues that you want to manage. You know there are problems in these areas typically, or you're concerned there might be problems in this area. Is there something we want to measure around that? Do you perhaps want what we call at the MCC basic level metrics, so metrics that are standard metrics that we think all organizations should consider measuring, or perhaps more advanced metrics that maybe will help with a deeper dive? Who's going to track the data? So even as you're thinking of the purpose of the metrics, well, who's actually going to do it? Who's going to track it? Who's going to generate the metrics? How are the metrics going to be used? How are the reports going to be reviewed? How are they going to be used to drive action? Because the worst thing you can do is spend time working through a metrics program, and actually the end of the metrics program is, right, here's your metrics report. Because unless people know what to do with a metrics report and it drives action, it really is a waste of time and not a good exercise. So think of that think that through beforehand. And then within our toolkits, we have documents that help you understand what's in the toolkit. So they give you an overview. So rather than going into that detailed workbook with all the definitions of the metrics, here's an overview that explains what the metrics are about. There's we have the process map. We've got another example here, a different area, a high-level process map around centralized and site monitoring process metrics. This is one of our recent toolkits that we've issued, and the metric workbook reference file that we talked about that has all those aspects in it that we referenced earlier. And then the metric selection and implementation support tools. So we have these really because we've defined a lot of metrics. So you can see as we've gone through this process, we've got different levels of metrics. We've got some that are basic, some that are advanced. We've got them on different dimensions: quality, timeliness, cycle time, efficiency, and so on. And it leads us actually to a large, I would think of it as a library of metrics. And we're not saying to people, we recommend you implement all these metrics. In fact, quite the reverse. Implement the metrics that make sense for your situation. And so we have some tools then to help you with selecting the metrics that might be most useful for you. And the tools, you can see them, there's 4 tools for selection, which you can see listed here. So they take you from those key performance questions to the appropriate metrics. From issues, so what sort of issues do I have in, let's say, in the central lab process? Might I have, then what metrics are recommended to consider? which metrics perhaps are the basic ones or the advanced ones or aspirational, and you can see those in Tool C. And then Tool D actually takes you the other way around. It says, rather than, what are my issues, my key performance questions, so on, it says, well, what data do I have access to? What data elements do I have access to? And if I've got access to these data elements, what MCC metrics could I potentially calculate and report? So lots of different ways to sort of navigate your way through all of the potential metrics you could use in the metrics toolkit. I'm going to share now a tool A. Let me just get that on the screen. Right. So here's tool A. I might just slightly increase the size of that, make it easier to see. So this is, again, we're back on Central Lab, and we've got here a list of key performance questions, and there's more down here. They're actually grouped by portfolio, so that's a cross study and also at the study level. And so you can look at this and say, well, what are my key performance questions? And so maybe my key performance questions are, these are some that I'm particularly interested in. And as you see, as I'm clicking on those, it's highlighting 2 metric references. And these references are references to MCC metrics. If we move over to the next tab, we'll see those 2 metrics in a bit more detail. Again, I think I'll just enlarge this rather, so you can see it a bit more easily. But there are those 2 metrics, so it's telling us what those 2 metrics are. And then over on the right here, we can see, again, we can see those 2 metrics highlighted. But what it's telling us now are, these are the data elements you'd need in order to report those metrics. And so what this tool has done then is it's taken us from key performance questions, which we've been able to select, down to the metrics that it's recommended to help answer those key performance questions, and then the data elements you'd need in order to calculate those metrics. And each of the tools sort of takes you through those steps, and so you can get right down to the data elements in each. And as I said, tool D, that last one, takes you the other way around. It takes you from the data elements to the metrics you could potentially calculate.
Keith, just to note, you end up with that little identifier code for the metric, which you can then go into that very detailed metric definition workbook, and you can look at all those details.
Right.
What is this metric? What questions does it answer? What's the performance target, etc. So it just gives you a way to, work with that companion reference, so you're not digging through the reference to try to pick metrics.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Linda. And so that's tools A to D. So those are the selection tools. And then this is one to help with implementation. This is the metrics reporting planning worksheet. So once you've decided what metrics you want to implement, then it's a tool really to help you with that planning. So let me just show you that one. So a bit of fun here. Right, there we go. That should be showing. So here we've got the different metrics again. So still we're in the Central Lab metric toolkit, and we've got those references that Linda was just mentioning, the metric descriptions, the key performance questions. So now perhaps you know which metrics you're interested in implementing. So let's select those metrics that we're interested in, for example, these ones. And what we see over on the right is we see some areas highlighted in yellow. And so it's asking us the question, are there any modifications? So in other words, is it exactly as the MCC definition? And so perhaps with this one, there's no change, but this one, yeah, actually there is a change for this one. Maybe the target is, whatever it might be, something different than is listed in the MCC metric. Who's going to track and report the metric? And typically this is done, of course, between a CRO and a central lab vendor, or it might be direct between a sponsor and the central lab, but someone is presumably going to have to track and report the metric. How often is that going to be done? And some other notes. So it's an opportunity for you to work with another party, and it might be within one organization or it might be across organizations, to define for the metrics you've agreed to monitor, how is that actually going to work? What exactly is the definition? Who's going to track that data and report it, and how often are they going to do it? So that's described those the different aspects and different elements of the metrics toolkit that we put together at the MCC. But I think hopefully by listening to us talk through this, you can see how you can use it from an MCC toolkit, but you can actually use that whole framework within your own organization or within a part of the organization to develop your own metrics too. But of course, within the MCC, we have the advantage that we're able to bring different parties together and pull all of this information together to create a library that you can select from.
Thank you, Keith. So in closing, we want to leave you with some of our lessons learned. First, metrics should have a purpose, and they should help you answer important questions. Process maps are a powerful tool to guide metric discussions. And that going through that process of identifying critical success factors and key performance questions really helps you define metrics that matter. Incorporate time, cost, and quality dimensions into the questions so you will end up with a balanced set of metrics. And here's a really important one. A metric definition is more than a formula. The details do matter, and including that contextual information with the definition will really help the end users be able to interpret results. And the final one goes back to that sort of, they're aligned with a process thought, which is your metrics should align with your current processes. And if you go through an update to processes, you may be, and we certainly have seen this in the monitoring area. We have an entire group at MCC that's now looking at, the monitoring process. It's no longer just site monitors. There's a centralized monitoring component. There's a remote component. There's an on-site component. And that triggered for us a massive review, starting with the process map, the key questions, et cetera, because the metrics really need to align with your process. And when you make changes, you need to update your metrics. And then in the final slide, Keith, we just want to leave you with a quote from one of our members. But this is a very typical sentiment that we hear. Having access to MCC metrics that align with key performance questions has been a game changer for us. Being able to focus on the questions we want to answer makes it easier to decide which metrics to use. So we want to thank you for joining us today. And I think we're going to answer a couple questions. Michelle, do you have some, or Keith? I know you guys have been monitoring the questions here.
Yes, so just if anyone has any additional questions, please feel free to add them into the chat right now. We do have one for you, Keith. The question is, this is the first we have, what's the reason for the KPQ was defined as such here was because this was the only reason identified leading to missed data. That was the question that wasn't answered previously.
Yes, thank you. So that's referring to that KPQ, and then the metric we were looking at, looking at the quality of lab samples received. That's the reason it was the group focused on that key performance question. That's true because of the concern around missing data. Of course, you could focus on the missing data. So you could say, how much missing data do we have? Or you could have a question like that and you could design a metric around that. And because the problem with that is it's quite late in the day. You want to get as early as possible a signal that you might have missing data. So I suppose the question then is, and this is what the group considered, is, well, what's the main reason that we have missing data? And they thought that's actually the main reason. But the point I guess you're making is that may not be the only reason that you have missing data. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of having a process map, because you can really start to look at it and look at control points and decide, you know, where are those critical points in the process where you often see problems, or, you know, as Keith said, are early indicators that you're not going to have data coming out in the end. Additionally, when you look at the measurements around what is it that, you know, has come in that doesn't meet the requirements, you know, there's a lot of reason. It doesn't tell you why they're coming in with problems. And so there's a lot of, it's really just the beginning in terms of doing root cause analysis, you know, as to what was the aspect around it not meeting the quality requirements. So therefore trying to figure out what corrective action, an immediate correction that has to happen, or there might be a more substantial corrective action that needs to happen because it could be systematic. You know, it's really just the beginning. There might be lots of measurements as you start doing root cause that you have to look at.
All right, well, thank you very much, Keith and Linda, for that extremely interesting webinar. I think with that, we will close our last Only webinar of 2021. Thank you, everybody, for joining. And if you enjoyed today's meeting, please be on the lookout for our future meetings in the new year of 2022. Thank you very much, everyone.